Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. On the show tonight,
this bombing was a reminder of the destructive power that an individual or a small group can muster.
After the Christmas Day bombing in Nashville, terrorism specialists weigh in on the rise of extremism in the U.S.
That wasn't just changing the future, but addressing the past.
When Illinois made marijuana legal, the state also made efforts to reverse old drug policies and criminal records.
Meet a local engineer who designed a spacecraft to better understand solar flares that can disrupt Earth's communication systems.
How a Trump administration order could limit the design of future federal buildings to classical styles.
It was surreal. That's the best way I can put it.
In part two of Making Sense of 2020, we look at the racial reckoning and unrest this past summer in Chicago.
And watch night still is a very emotional thing for me to talk about.
A New Year's Eve tradition. Watch night services are held in many African American churches on December 31st, commemorating the Emancipation Proclamation.
Many's the time I've been mistaken.
And he's got a virtual concert set for New Year's Eve. We revisit our recent conversation with Chicago's Grammy-winning jazz vocalist Kurt Elling. But first, some of today's top stories. Chicago Public Schools says most of its early learning faculty will return when in-person classes resume next month. School officials say that nearly 6,000 of its 7,000 pre-K and cluster teachers will be returning to the classroom in January. Those classes are set to resume January 11th, while K through 8 follows in February. Meanwhile, local school council members at one school, Vaughn Occupational High School on the north side, say they will not accept students or faculty back next month until there's more dialogue between the community and CPS. And the Illinois Department of Public Health is reporting more than 5,600 new and confirmed probable cases of the coronavirus in Illinois and 106 more deaths. That brings the number of total cases to nearly 950,000 and 16,179 deaths. The 7-day statewide test positivity rate is 8.8%. The head of Chicago's water department is stepping down. Water Department Commissioner Randy Connor announced his resignation today, 3.5 years after taking the top job. He took over an agency that was found to harbor a hostile workplace with an overtly racist and sexist atmosphere, according to a then report put out by the city's Inspector General. When asked by WTTW News about the impetus for his resignation, Connor said, quote, "It's just time." And you don't need us to tell you, it's snowing out. Chicago region is in the midst of its first winter storm of the season, with totals between 2 and 4 inches expected in the city and as much as 7 inches in parts of the north and west suburbs. The precipitation is expected to switch to freezing rain just after midnight before temperatures rise tomorrow. And we'll have the 5-day forecast a bit later in the program. Friday will mark a year since it became legal to buy and use cannabis in Illinois. But what about the thousands of people who previously got in trouble for with the law for possessing, smoking, or selling pot? Amanda Vinicky joins us now with a look at Illinois' expungement efforts. Amanda.
Paris, in some ways, it was like a light switch flicked off January 1st of this year. Suddenly, it was no longer illegal to possess or to smoke weed. But what about the people who'd gotten in trouble with the law before that time, before that switch flicked off, say for possessing 30 grams of cannabis flower, the same amount that's now permitted? Well, Illinois' law tackled that too.
So the legislation was both forward thinking as well as retroactive in addressing the past harm caused by the same activity that's now legal under the law.
That Illinois law establishing a process for expunging low-level pot convictions from people's criminal records. In some cases, that will be done automatically for more recent and lower-level convictions. But even that could take years. In other cases, it is up to individuals to try to get it done themselves.
The law, although it created this process, does not guarantee somebody would be granted. The state's attorney in the county of conviction is still allowed to object, and the court is allowed to apply factors under the law to consider when making a decision whether or not to grant the relief. So there is an adversarial process that could be in place depending how states' attorneys' offices and the judiciary reacts to an individual coming before them.
Complicated, right? Well, that's where a project called New Leaf Illinois comes in. Using proceeds from the legalization of marijuana, Illinois is funding an effort that gets people access to attorneys to help with the expungement process. Brandon Williams, who's part of that effort, says it's important because having a criminal record can hurt someone's chances for housing, getting into a particular school, and getting a job, even potentially a job in the now legal weed industry.
In order to do that, they have to get a fingerprint-based background check. And during that process, of course, if they have a criminal record, even if it's just an arrest, it can show up on their record. And that can be an automatic barrier for an employer to say, hey, you're a risk, just no matter what the arrest is or what the conviction may be. Just having an arrest period from whether it's marijuana or anything else can be a barrier to somebody getting a license in order to be employed in the cannabis industry.
Williams says Black and brown people in their communities were most severely caught in the criminal justice cycle because of what started as small pot convictions. And he says they shouldn't be haunted by that forever.
Nobody should be punished for the rest of their lives because they have a criminal record. Nobody knows the circumstances of how that criminal record even came about. And so, I can understand, somebody got convicted of murder or armed robbery 2 years ago. Obviously, somebody's going to want to know that. But people with, these convictions in most situations are 10, 20, even 30 years old, where people can still look at their record and, form their own biased opinion because they may have a criminal record.
Now, pandemic-related court closures have slowed this vacating and expungement process some, and New Leaf just got up and running last month. But Williams says Illinois' law is a great first step and should be an example for other states. Attorney Gray Mateo Harris says expungement can have a tremendous impact, not just on individuals, but on their families.
It can be tremendous, right? We know that there are people out there who are highly qualified to be employed in certain capacities and who have been unfortunately shut out of job opportunities because of a cannabis conviction. We know that there are people out there who are strong, good tenants who are being shut out from opportunities to live in their desired apartments simply because of a cannabis conviction.
No matter the particulars of someone's situation, she says New Leaf Illinois is there to help.
Just like me, yo hablo español y muchos de nuestras organizaciones también. So many of our organizations will speak Spanish. Just as me, many of the attorneys will be there and will also be specially trained on how to help unique populations, right? Not just from the language issues, which might go beyond Spanish to other languages, but also to help with the complicated immigration concerns that might really come up. For individuals who are seeking both a cannabis conviction clearance and also to proceed under DACA or another form of immigration relief.
The state has rolling deadlines for those automatic expungements, but the attorneys that I spoke with today say they encourage anyone with a pot-related conviction to give New Leaf Illinois a call. This is free legal assistance that can help to determine someone's eligibility for expungement and then also to get them help working through that process. And again, this is all paid for by the state using taxes and fees for those who are now taking part in the now legal marijuana industry. And we will get up on our website, Paris, a link to New Leaf, Illinois. So back to you.
All right, Amanda, and a lot to watch for in 2021 with this. Thank you so much. And now we go to Phil Ponce and a look at renewed fears about domestic terrorism. Phil.
Thanks, Paris. Many details surrounding the Christmas Day bombing in downtown Nashville remain unclear, including the bomber's motive and any possible ties to extremist groups. But the incident has renewed concerns about the rise of domestic terrorism in the United States and the proliferation of racist ideology by white supremacists. Joining us with more are Tom Makaitis, a security and terrorism specialist and a professor of history at DePaul University, and Brian Levin, director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And first of all, Brian Levin, authorities say that it appears that the Nashville bomber acted alone. What does this say about the nature of attacks that might be of concern to you?
That is such a great question. You know, a lot of times we look at this stuff through a political lens, but just organizationally, we're in the era of do-it-yourself terrorism. So, for instance, post-Charlottesville, these larger over-the-top groups with return addresses generally fell into disfavor. There are some like, well, I don't want to give their names, but you know who they are. They're still floating around. But what we are seeing is an overlay. We have three types of motivations for symbolic acts of violence. One is ideological. Two, we have folks who are unstable and what we call psychologically dangerous. Three, personal benefit or revenge, and you could have a combo, but one floats up on top like a root beer float. So what I think we're seeing is, because of the internet and social media, particularly now when people are isolated, there you have it. We are seeing do-it-yourselfers committing acts of mass violence in this country. Sometimes, and I like to call them the wild card, sometimes the motives aren't readily apparent, like Stephen Paddock in Las Vegas. There is some suspicion that he might have had some far-right ideological leanings, but we just never found out what motivated that attack. Here we'll see, but it could be a combo. Always look for that wild card. We're in a diversifying, fragmenting type of threat matrix where white supremacists and far right still are at the helm. But I think we're going to see a bit of an insurgency in the near future, similar to what we saw in the 70s when conservatives came into power and the left was elected out.
Well, in the case of the Nashville bomber, authorities are still reluctant, or still not calling it terrorism, and here's what they had to say on Sunday.
When we assess an event for domestic terrorism nexus, it has to be tied to an ideology. It's the use of force or violence in the furtherance of a political, social ideology or bent. We haven't tied to that yet.
Tom Makaitis, is that a reasonable definition? That is to say, an act committed to advance a political or social ideology?
It is for academics, but for the general public, it's a distinction without a difference. They were terrified. It was highly successful. It was tactically quite brilliant. There was no clear evidence of a strategy. I would agree with what Brian said. The term I use is idiosyncratic lone wolf, very much like Ted Kaczynski, if you remember the Unabomber. An individual who was motivated by an internal pathology, an internal dynamic. He happened to hate technology. He was upset airplanes were flying over his house. So what did he do? He started attacking that. He was also angry at universities and whatnot. There's some suggestion there may be a connection to the AT&T building. He may have bought into this conspiracy theory that's popular in Britain that 5G is a spying technology of some bizarre type. We really don't know. He was apparently a bright guy. He fits the pattern of the lone wolf, though. It's striking to me, ideology or not, he has some things in common with the Christchurch shooter. He's a loner. He's not very well attached. The big difference, and the reason the FBI is holding back, there isn't the manifesto. And I think that's what's puzzling everybody. There is no clear statement like we saw with all these others. Even if it's bizarre, we could understand that there was something he was trying to achieve. The absence of messaging is in many ways more frightening than if we knew, no matter how crazy it sounded.
Brian Levin, to what extent should people in large urban centers like Chicago be how concerned should people in large urban centers like Chicago be about these lone wolves, or idiosyncratic attackers?
Well, the one thing is they like large gatherings. So what's interesting about 2020, at least, it was kind of like a shaked up soda bottle. And what I think what we'll see is going forward, that's going to uncork later on. That being said, there are all kinds of risks attendant in life. And I wouldn't overly worry about this, except we are going to have some kind of insurgency on the hard right and the white supremacists, which are a globalized movement, and they feed off each other. I'm not saying this particular perpetrator was that, but we also have these elastic, and that's why Tom was so great, these elastic ideologies like Boogaloo, which cross the ideological spectrum, or at least can, accelerationists who want to burn everything down. And so the problem is at this time when we have folks who are online more, they're many times estranged from their family. 27% of the people have family estrangements. Gun sales have gone up. The percentage of people saying that violence is okay, political polarization, all this kind of fragmentation creates these ticking time bombs. But unlike in the past, when there was a hierarchical group, now they dine at a buffet where they take a variety of ideologies, some of which seem to be conflicting with each other, and mix it into this personal stew that Tom was talking about. That's what we're calling the wild card. And what I would say is expect this kind of difficulty sometimes with some of these offenders who are angry and might have an array of motivations or an unclear one. But white supremacists, far right, will continue to be what we are most focused on in a diversifying threat matrix. Don't forget, we're seeing all kinds of extremism rise in recent years.
Tom Makaitis, two key dates coming up, January 6th and January 20th, the date of Joe Biden's inauguration. Concern about violence on those 2 days?
Absolutely, especially January 6th. I think the cork in the bottle analogy Brian uses is extremely good. I think the only thing that's kept a lid on it is that the president's base still harbor these bizarre notions that there will be some legal miracle at the 11th hour, that the vice president won't certify the results, or there'll be some movement in Congress to change it. Once that last shred of hope is removed, that's when the risk is. And I totally agree with Brian. The thing is that these kinds of attackers are a nightmare for counterterrorists because there is no group, there's no chatter, there's nothing to trace, there's nobody to follow. Most of the extremist groups that he mentioned, Boogaloo Boys, Proud Boys, Three Percenters, Oath Keepers, we could go on forever. It's not them I worry about nearly as much as the hangers-on, the people who go online, they read the ideology, they get pumped up, and they decide that they're going to go out and do it. Ironically, some of the extremist groups have non-violence, non-discrimination statements, which is a joke. But the fact is, they know that then they can pour this gasoline on the flames. Somebody out there is going to be unstable enough to pick it up and do something. Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha is a classic example.
Tom Makaitis, Brian Levin, thank you both for your insights into this very disturbing trend. And up next, how a local researcher got $75 million for a project with NASA to protect Earth's communications infrastructure.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
About 1 million miles from the sun, in the Earth's outermost atmospheric layer, a spacecraft will measure ultraviolet light to better understand and predict space weather. Now, that space weather, which includes solar flares, can badly disrupt communications here on Earth. A local engineer is leading the GLIDE spacecraft mission, which stands for Global Lyman Alpha Imagers of the Dynamic Exosphere. NASA recently awarded the GLIDE mission a $75 million budget. Joining us is the principal investigator of NASA's GLIDE mission, Lara Waldrop, an assistant professor of electrical and mechanical engineering at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Welcome to Chicago Tonight, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what will the GLIDE spacecraft be doing roughly 1 million miles from the sun?
Well, it'll be taking pictures of the Earth on a 30-minute cadence for 2 straight years. The idea is that the Earth's outermost atmospheric layer, as you mentioned, responds to these storms. And in fact, we've learned over the past few years that it plays a key role in governing that response. It controls the intensity of the storms as well as their duration. And the more we know about it, the better our models will be, and the better we can essentially mitigate the worst effects of these storms when they happen.
So solar storms, they create these, it's very beautiful aurorae, the northern and southern lights in the sky, but are they a danger to people or the infrastructure and equipment on Earth?
Well, they certainly can be. For space assets, things such as satellites, communications, navigation satellites, weather satellites, they commonly cause a lot of problems, both charging and short circuits of some of the electronics, but also just data upsets. But more significantly is when some of these stronger storms start to really penetrate closer to the Earth, where they can cause a lot of problems to humans. For example, air traffic needs to be diverted from the poles during some of these big storms to prevent the passengers from getting too strong of a radiation dose. They can induce currents in the power line systems on the ground and cause a lot of heating and outages and problems like that. So it's something that not just NASA, but of course a lot of different fields are interested in being able to know when they're coming, how strong they're going to be when they do come, and what can we do to avoid some of the worst effects.
And of course, you'll also measure how hydrogen atoms escape Earth's atmosphere into space, and this can lead to the slow evaporation of our planet's water reservoirs. What will those findings tell us?
That's right. Well, we know at Earth that this is a very slow process. We're not in danger anytime soon of losing our water. On the other hand, we're very interested in knowing what happened to Mars's water and other solar system planets, for example, exoplanets. Are they habitable? Do they have water? Being able to understand when we see their hydrogen exospheres around these planets, what that means as far as the water that they contain on the surface, this is a very important thing to be able to do. So by learning more, essentially treating the Earth as a natural laboratory, we'll be able to understand this process a lot better elsewhere.
And of course, we talk about the exosphere, but what is it and why don't we know more about it and its relationship to the sun?
Sure. So the exosphere, as I mentioned, is the outermost atmospheric layer, but specifically, it's very different from the atmosphere that we live in and breathe. It's the region, it's defined as a region where it's so thin that the atoms that make up the exosphere never collide with one another. Essentially, it's collisionless. They fly of their own accord, and the only force that they're subject to is gravity, which means that hot ones can escape the Earth's gravitational field and fly off into space and be lost forever. Now, the reason it's very difficult, and we don't know much about this region at all, is because it's so huge. It's very difficult to see it all at once. We've taken plenty of measurements near Earth's surface, so to speak. The exosphere extends almost halfway to the moon, around 100,000 miles away. So being able to get far enough away and take a picture of it has only been done 4 times in the past, and we'll be doing it 4 times every few hours.
Well, and so, you said that only 4 images have ever been taken of the exosphere. And of course, as you just said, the GLIDE spacecraft will take one every 30 minutes. Are you expecting any unforeseen findings and discoveries?
Oh, wow, we hope so. The fact that we'll be able to turn these images into movies and turn both the images and the movies into real physical data that can be used by models, we expect this to be revolutionary, essentially, in the field of exospheric physics, but also in the space weather modeling, very groundbreaking research. As far as discoveries, though, we'll keep our eyes open. I think with it being such a new field, we're certainly optimistic and expect some surprises.
So what is your time frame for this mission? For example, when will the spacecraft launch? How long will it be in orbit? And how long before you have some data?
Well, it's a long process. This one's a little bit faster because we'll be sharing a ride into space. So our launch date is fixed. Right now, we're looking at an early 2025 launch. We will be undergoing some design reviews, making sure that our plan is as solid as it can be before we start fabricating in about a year. And then once we launch in early 2025, it'll take us about 4 months to get out to a place far enough away in space where we can turn around and start acquiring these images regularly. And so once we're there, we'll be there for 2 years at a minimum.
So we'll definitely have to have you back in 4 years then, just as you're getting ready for launch to talk about it again.
So, absolutely.
All right, Laura Waldrop, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Best of luck and congrats on your award.
Thank you.
Up next, limits on the look of government buildings.
Latinos, who make up 1/3 of the population, continue to power the city that works.
These are the people that are working 3 jobs, knowing that COVID is out there. Those are the people that need the help, and we should help them.
President Trump has issued an executive order titled Promoting Beautiful Federal Civic Architecture. The plan essentially proposes to make classical architecture the de facto style of future federal buildings of a certain size. It also creates a new federal council that will serve until September of next year and submit a report to the new administration. In February, Trump first put out a draft executive order on the topic of federal building architecture. Our Quinn Myers brought us the story when the draft plan was unveiled. Here's another look.
Chicago's Federal Center and Plaza has been called a modernist masterpiece. Completed in 1974 by famed architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, the courthouse, post office, and office buildings have become symbols of Chicago's architectural prowess and spirit of innovation.
Federal buildings are significant in the sense that they reflect who we are as a society and sort of what we value and the cultures that we uphold and the cultures that we elevate.
But under the proposed Trump administration executive order, buildings like the Federal Center and other government projects designed in a modern style would have a hard time getting built. Under the order, the federal government would prioritize classical architecture. Picture the U.S. Capitol building or the White House for future federal courthouses and buildings that cost more than $50 million. Classical and traditional architecture styles have proven their ability to inspire such respect for our system of self-government, the order reads. Their use should be encouraged. Since coming to light earlier this year, the draft order has been met with widespread condemnation. Critics say the government should not be deciding what is and isn't beautiful.
This notion that classical architecture is, the only thing that we elevate, I think that's where we have a real missed opportunity.
Kimberly Dowdell is president of the National Organization of Minority Architects, a group that promotes diversity and inclusion in the field. She says the executive order isn't just a limit on creativity, that in certain contexts, it also carries a legacy of oppression.
The buildings that are being highlighted here or propped up are, essentially buildings that don't reflect, the brightest parts of our history, specifically referencing, slavery and other parts of history that are not particularly well received by, the African American communities.
The draft order puts several modern federal buildings in its crosshairs, like the San Francisco Federal Building and the Austin U.S. Courthouse. The executive order does complement one recent federal commission, the Neoclassical Courthouse and Federal Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, completed in 2011. The building was designed by HBRA Architects in Chicago, where Eric Lasher is the current director of design. He says the classical style can offer certain advantages for public buildings.
They have a certain clarity, a certain cogency, so that the public who might be unfamiliar with the building can have, if it's well designed, an intuitive understanding of where to go and how the building is laid out or works.
But Lasher says those qualities aren't the exclusive domain of classicism, and he's dismayed the Tuscaloosa building was included in the executive order. He says the courthouse shouldn't be used as an ideological pawn, but instead a celebration of architecture that's reflective of its local culture.
A one-size-fits-all approach seems to me to be contrary to the whole American idea.
That view is shared by Carol Ross Barney, a Chicago architect who has designed CTA stations, sections of the Riverwalk, and other public buildings and spaces. She was also the first woman to be commissioned to design a federal building, the modernist replacement to the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, after it was bombed in 1995.
Federal courthouses and federal buildings are immensely complex. The level of security and the level of protection that you have to provide, the truth of the matter is the Parthenon just wouldn't do it.
Ross Barney says the government should stick with its current guiding principles for federal architecture, authored by future Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the early 1960s. They specifically forbid establishing an official federal style.
I think what's really good about Moynihan is he recognized that. He doesn't really talk about style. It's interesting because the proposed presidential order talks about style and says no brutalism. Nobody does brutalism anymore anyway.
Chicago has a long history with classical architecture, including the structures of the 1893 World's Fair and Daniel Burnham's influential 1909 Plan of Chicago. Many notable civic examples are still in use today, like City Hall, the Cultural Center, and a newer addition, the Harold Washington Library. Even the site of the current Federal Center, in all its sleek modernity, has classical roots. It was once occupied by the mammoth Chicago Federal Building, a Beaux-Arts structure that took up an entire city block. Ross Barney is complimentary of the building, but says ultimately, like the proposed executive order, it just wasn't the right fit.
For one thing, it didn't have the place for people to gather and protest that this one does. And I just think that that courthouse is so more appropriate as an expression of Chicago.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Quinn Myers.
The newly created federal council will serve until September 30th, 2021, and will then submit a report to the Biden administration. No word on what Biden will do with those recommendations. Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, looking back at a summer of racial reckoning in Chicago in part 2 of Making Sense of 2020. Here from our latest community conversation, we talk with religious leaders about the significance of Watch Night for the Black community. And we revisit our conversation with Grammy winner Kurt Elling as he gets set for a new live New Year's Eve show. But first, some more of today's top stories. 11th hour negotiations and political gamesmanship on a plan to provide $2,000 in stimulus payments to individuals. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell blocked a standalone attempt to vote on that bill. He has reportedly tied it now to unrelated items like a repeal of liability protections for social media companies, also known as Section 230, and the establishment of a commission to investigate election fraud. Illinois Senior Senator Dick Durbin joined other Democrats calling on McConnell to allow a vote on the $2,000 stimulus.
For goodness sake, stop looking for poison pills, Senator McConnell. Pass this right now. America needs it.
And it is treacherous out there on many of the area's roadways, if not all of them. The Chicago area will be in the grips of a winter storm for most of the rest of the night. The city could see between 2 and 4 inches of snow before precipitation switches over to freezing rain after midnight. Totals could reach as high as 7 inches in the northern and western suburbs, with little accumulations expected south of the city. As 2020 winds down, we are reflecting on a year like no other. Earlier this month, WTTW prepared a 3-part documentary looking at the people and events of a year that will be hard to forget. It also took you inside our newsroom to see just how we delivered the important stories during these very trying times. Here is part 2 of Making Sense of 2020.
I've watched all of the video coverage of George Floyd's encounter with the 4 shameful Minneapolis police officers who took his life.
It's not normal that police are empowered to feel like putting your foot on somebody's neck is okay.
We don't know how many times we have to say, view us, Black Americans, as full human beings.
What it means to be Black in the city of Chicago and to die disproportionately from COVID-19, to die disproportionately from hypertension to begin with, to be not believed when you show up at a police station.
Decades of disinvestment in the south and west sides of the city.
This is centuries of built up frustration, centuries of being underserved.
To all of that, we must now add a knee to the neck.
I can't breathe. Please, the knee in my neck. I can't breathe shit.
This is not the first time this has happened, and they had had enough. We had had enough.
Protests started on Friday.
I started reporting that Saturday, following Memorial Day.
Folks holding their signs to show their anger and frustration at the killing of George Floyd. Systemic racism, the vast inequities, not just in our public health system, but in our criminal justice system.
What's happening right now is a result of what happened with George Floyd.
The Black community in Chicago led us into having conversations and debates about systemic racism and policing. It included the Latino community, the Asian community, the white community.
And the Black lives that are being lost in our city all these years matter very much.
I remember, sitting at home that weekend, kind of like watching it, and I guess kind of like processing it myself, right? Like, what do I tell my son? Don't touch me. Hey, take it easy, guys. Take it easy.
And honestly, I was really shocked to hear that the mayor said that there was going to be a curfew, and I knew that that was huge news.
Downtown streets just empty.
If you fail to comply, you may be arrested and/or subject to other police enforcement.
And it wasn't even 12 hours later when she called out the National Guard.
It was surreal. That's the best way I can put it. I was filming arrests.
It was a really, really chaotic scene.
And I was posting it in real time.
I'm covering it. I'm doing my job.
To make sure that we are round the clock providing coverage.
On Twitter, lots of videos.
We're just trying to be there for when people need us,
If that happens at 1 a.m, that's when it happens.
It's out there for as long as my phone was alive. I think with 2% left, I walked back to the car.
What are they charged with?
Nothing. Not a goddamn thing.
Why are they being arrested?
Why are they detaining me?
Why are they being detained?
They have not said why they're detaining me.
I can't explain.
They have not charged me with anything.
There was never a question of, this can wait until the morning.
Started seeing that they were going to suspend CTA service. And I just walked downstairs and went around the corner. And, there was an attendant at the station who was saying, yeah, that train is shut down. The L is shut down.
There's a lot of closed doors in the city. There's a lot of meetings that are happening that are not being broadcast on Zoom.
We knew that there were conversations going on between the mayor and the aldermen.
We got audio from this emergency meeting of all the aldermen and the mayor that was called during the worst of the rioting. And let's take a look at a heated discussion between Mayor Lori Lightfoot and aldermen on Sunday. You have aldermen where you hear someone breaking glass behind them and someone goes, oh no, they've broken in.
They're shooting like it's a wild, South. It's crazy. I got videos of people shooting at other people.
Aldermen talking about how gang members are keeping watch of stores and indiscriminately shooting at people.
I've got gangbangers with AK-47s walking around right now, just waiting to settle some scores.
What was discovered later was that this actually violated the law, this meeting, because it was a public meeting that was held in private and the public didn't have any notice that this was going to happen.
That did a real service to let Chicago know how their elected representatives were responding to this really, hopefully, once-in-a-lifetime incident.
Greg Pratt, give us a sense of the scope of the devastation from the early week looting and rioting.
The whole South Side, it was terrible. Every major commercial intersection was being looted and pillaged and ransacked all throughout the whole South Side.
All of this happening as neighborhood volunteers worked to clean the site from the shards of smashed glass from some of the riots over the weekend. And we spoke with an onlooker who was just simply distraught at what he was seeing.
I do understand the anger, the frustration that have plagued across our country, even our city of Chicago. However, I don't think that this is the answer to solve anything right about now.
You're hurting those people that are unable to go anywhere. We fought for 6 years to get a grocery store, and now we can't go to it.
One of the complaints I've heard from business owners and residents is they didn't see enough police out on the south and west sides. What did you see?
The police were scattered. I watched a group of officers standing over at a gas station where across the street at a Family Dollar was getting looted, no one moved.
It's very important for the media to as they cover, because you should cover, storefronts that get broken into, the downtown district when windows get smashed, but we should also make sure that we center in this discussion the conditions that produce the violence to begin with.
And I'll tell you something, during that week we went down to Pilsen And there was a real sense of fear in that neighborhood. There was a sense that there was a big race and gang war about to take place.
What I experienced last night, I've never seen before. We've seen anti-black racism.
There are videos on Facebook, on Instagram, where you have Latino gangbangers on 26th Street, standing on 26th and Kedzie with baseball bats and barriers, yelling in English and Spanish how they're going to keep African Americans, anyone who's black, from coming into their community.
And that's why we're here, right? To address the anti-blackness that exists in our communities.
We were standing on the corner on 18th Street, and this woman comes up and gives me a $1 bill, which I thought was really strange. And she walked away. And then about half an hour later, this kid comes up and says, call the number on the $1 bill. My mom wants to talk to you, but she's afraid of being seen talking to the media. We talked about how she was so disappointed in some of the behavior she was seeing in her community, namely prejudice against African Americans. That was invaluable to our reporting, just capturing the tone of the situation. I don't think you earn trust in 5 minutes. I don't think you earn it in even 5 months. A big part of trust is just being there, being present, not necessarily coming in with an agenda.
As you can see, several hundred, if not more than 1,000 marchers. They started having African-American, Hispanic, Latino unity marches to kind of put the brakes on the tension. The city avoided a worst-case scenario.
You know, we're definitely here to stand in solidarity with the Black community, to say Black Lives Matter, and that we need justice.
What's the best way to engage and inspire our communities in Chicago to reflect on what's been going on? Why don't we dedicate a show to talking to community members? People have been impacted by police violence and racism.
So we did the Peace and Justice special, which aired 2 weeks after Memorial Day.
We don't want just the flash and the shock value. We want to understand the issues.
Now, Democrats in D.C. today, they've introduced a bill. It's being dubbed the Justice in Policing Act.
At the core of the question of police reform is the question around how do we moderate a society such that people are safe, that their property and their well-being is secure, and that their ability to go about pursuing what we sometimes call the American dream is unabated and is not met violently.
I've never received so many emails in my life, from corporate America included, that actually is for the first time using the phrase Black Lives Matter.
For me, that was really important to see, not only as a Black woman, but a Black woman that works here, to see us kind of blow out our normal newscast and dedicate a full hour to that.
To cover it and to give it some context and analysis.
We can't solve the problem, but we can tell the story of the problem.
For many Chicagoans, George Floyd's killing by a police officer, captured on camera, was a sadly familiar sight.
A Cook County judge ruled today that the city must release the video purported to show a police officer shooting a 17-year-old African-American named Laquan McDonald.
We rewound a little bit further to talk about the history of police brutality and the amount of distrust that exists between those communities and the police, and why that is.
He took a rock to the head during a march. In 1968, Black Panthers Mark Clark and Fred Hampton took bullets.
We had Paris in North Lawndale. They end up speaking to the owner of a pharmacy whose shop was untouched by any of the protests and demonstrations and looting.
If there is some criminal activity going on, I don't call the police. I find out who's calling shots. And then once I do that, then I deal with them directly. That you get more respect that way, because the community is saying, okay, we appreciate that you're not calling the police. You're willing to deal with us one-on-one.
That really hit me, because that made me realize how different our lives are. That was education right there.
We talked about what's called the talk in many Black communities.
Thinking about all of the extra steps that we have to take as people of color when interacting with law enforcement to essentially just ensure that we're able to make it home safely.
You're pulled over by an officer. What do you do?
The talk. It's a regular conversation families have with their Black children about how to interact with law enforcement in public.
I would put my phone on the dashboard so they know it's not a weapon.
We had to have that conversation before he actually started driving, and once he did start driving, then it was more intense.
I know what to do, and so I would try to respect the police officers, comply to what they're saying, let them know that I'm a minor and that they should contact my parents, and lastly, never run.
The Black community, and I would say by extension, other communities of color, have always demanded better from their local news. Too often, when they're portrayed in mass media, it's in a negative light. We felt it was very important to invest in providing greater visibility and voice to the Black community, to the Latino community, by launching 2 new programs on the weekends. Latino Voices, Black Voices.
Good evening and welcome to the very first edition of Chicago Tonight, Black Voices.
Good evening y bienvenidos to the very first edition of Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices.
These 2 communities are Chicago.
Everyone can look up Pearlie Smith, Yvonne McNeil, Sanji Taylor, Melissa Williams, Aura Rosario, Sandra Bland. There's a lot in which we have to do to demand justice.
In recent months, she's also become a leader in the movement to keep the mall running as is.
Target, Costco, y nosotros nos preguntamos, ¿realmente la comunidad necesita eso? Nosotros somos un concepto único que emplea a más de 400 personas.
My beloved Alpha Kappa Alpha, our Divine Nine, and my HBCU brothers and sisters.
I think that it really kind of highlights this idea that it's wonderful at this point to see someone get that opportunity to break through that glass ceiling.
I certainly want to give viewers an impression of what it is like to live the experience of a Latino Chicagoan or a Black Chicagoan. These shows are not just for Latino people or just for Black people.
The solutions, what happens next, all of us have skin in the game.
And tomorrow night we'll have part 3 of Making Sense of 2020. And you can show your appreciation for the work we do by visiting WTTW.com/makingsense and supporting the WTTW Fund for Independent News. And up next, highlights from last night's Chicago Tonight Black Voices Community Conversation. But first, we take a look at the weather.
Watch Night, also known as Freedom's Eve, is a religious service held in many African American churches on New Year's Eve. It celebrates the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the Black people who were enslaved in Confederate states during the Civil War. As a part of Chicago Tonight's new programs, Black Voices and Latino Voices, we host monthly conversations designed to bring us together with our community. Last night, I was joined by Chicago religious leaders to talk about the annual tradition. Here's a clip of Reverend Waltrina Middleton of the Community Renewal Society. She shares her memories of Watch Night growing up in the Gullah Sea Islands of South Carolina.
I think for me, what I remember is when the lights were dimmed and the deacons or the elders in the church would go into these little rooms and they would do this call and response where someone actually pretended to be the watchman. And they would sing this song called, "Oh, watchman, please tell me the hour of the night." And they would do that for back and forth repeatedly until it became closer to midnight. And the prayers, it was almost just as Dr. Logan said, it felt like thunder. The prayers would just fill the place and you really could feel the power and presence of God and people just overjoyed by the idea that we are being brought into a new year.
And you can watch the full conversation at WTTW.com/news. And join Chicago Tonight Latino Voices host Hugo Balta on January 25th for our next community conversation. As New Year's Eve approaches, many of us are missing the usual celebrations and live music especially. Earlier this month, Paris spoke with an internationally known local artist about how he's handling the COVID shutdown. Here's another look.
Grammy-winning jazz singer and Chicago native Kurt Elling may not be able to perform for a live crowd these days, but that hasn't stopped him from holding court at the celebrated Green Mill for a series of virtual concerts. Take a look.
There was a boy, a certain strange enchanted boy. Say he traveled very far over land and sea.
Elling is adapting during the COVID-19 shutdown by performing via live streams that viewers pay to watch, like any other live show. And jazz singer Kurt Elling joins us now. His recent album, Secrets Are the Best Stories, was just nominated for a Grammy Award in the Best Jazz Vocal category. Kurt Elling, congratulations, and great to see you on Chicago Tonight.
Thank you, Paris. Thanks for having me once again.
All right, so everyone knows it's really difficult for working musicians out there right now, and you've put this marvelous series of live stream concerts together at the Green Mill. They look great, they sound great. How have they been going?
It's been a pleasure to sing. It's been a pleasure to be able to pay my musicians a fraction of what they're worth, but at least something. It's been a pleasure to have time at the Green Mill, even when it's been completely empty. It's important for me to be able to sing. It's an identity. It is a craft. It is an expression of my physiology to be able to vibrate with sound at these levels, and so it's been a real godsend to me.
Especially the way you sing. It is a craft. And how do you deal with not having a live audience there and the energy that a live audience brings?
Well, there's a couple of ways. One, you could think of it as a studio take. You know, when we're making records in the studio, there's generally nobody around, and oftentimes there's nobody in the room. There's maybe nobody within 30, 40 feet of you. And you give your all and you focus on the music and singing as well as you can, performing as well as you can, playing to the other musicians. That having been said, at the Green Mill, it's easy enough for me to, I should say, imagine my audience there. I've played there so many nights and I've seen so many beautiful faces over the years, and the ghosts are available all the time. And frankly, there are 5 cameras looking at me, so I can play to those as well. You know what that feels like.
Absolutely. The ghost of Al Capone there at the Green Mill. Is this a way for performers to make a living right now? Is this sustainable? I mean, I saw you've streamed them on Facebook. You've done subscription series. Is this a way that musicians can make money because they're hurting right now?
Well, you can make some amount, but it's nothing like the kind of touring schedule that I would usually have. Usually I'm on the road upwards of 200 nights a year. And to do a handful of live streams, even though it's a pleasure, and even though we can broadcast to several, I should say, 1,000 more people on a given occasion than we usually do, it's nothing like the paycheck, the experience, the exchange that we have with a live audience. And it's nothing like the schedule that we have for a regular year. It's something. It's better than nothing. It's survival. I can't quite say that it's break even yet.
So you're definitely hot to get back on the road and performing in front of audiences, as all other musicians are. You recently moved back to Chicago. You were in New York for 11 years after being from Rockford, to going to the U of C, growing up in music here. What's it like to be back?
Well, I mean, it's COVID time, so it's tough to say. We're happy to be back. We have so many beautiful friends and family members here that we've been longing to reconnect with on a more regular basis, and we can't, let alone all the folks I would have seen just glancingly performing for live audiences at the Mill or at the City Winery or at Orchestra Hall, or interacting with other musicians who I would have gone out to see their gigs by now, let alone going to, the zoo with my kid, let alone going to the museum with my daughter, let alone, all these kinds of things that you can't do because of COVID. So it's a little bit tough to say. I love the sights, sounds, and smells. I'm not experiencing most of them, as most people are not.
And do you think that the music scene in Chicago, the jazz scene, the independent venues, can they come roaring back once we're vaccinated, or will there be permanent damage here?
My hope is that enough of the places that are vital and necessary survive until that time. If we can get open, if we can get back to full employment of the wait staff, of the musicians, people are holding on. Whoever can make it to the finish line is going to be, I think, overburdened with willing patrons. It's going to be a matter of when that timing is.
Again, that was a conversation Paris had with Kurt Elling earlier this month. Elling will have a new streaming concert from the Green Mill on New Year's Eve. You can find information about that on our website. Paris, I'm sure you'll be tuning in. That is our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
And you can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night, live at 7. How political wrangling in Washington, D.C. may affect your pocketbook as 2020 comes to a close.
And struggling independent music venues find a glimmer of hope in the Save Our Stages relief package. And we leave you tonight with more from Kurt Elling at the Green Mill. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
There was a boy, a certain strange enchanted boy. Say he traveled very far, over land and sea. A little shy instead of I, but very wise was he.
Closed captioning is made possible in part by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, wishing all a happy and healthy holiday season.